I paid for half the wedding, then they told me I wasn't invited. I remember staring at the message on my phone, thinking it had to be a mistake. A prank, maybe. Something written in the heat of an argument that would be taken back with a hasty apology. But no. My cousin Marissa had typed every word with full intention. And my aunt, who'd once braided my hair before school dances and called me her second daughter, had signed off on it. Since you've made it clear you're not willing to support this union, it would be better if you didn't attend. Emotions are high, and we want this day to be about love. That was their version of gratitude for refusing to cover the remaining $18,000 they needed for the reception upgrade. Before we begin the story, how old are you, and where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. Now, enjoy the story. My name is Leah, I'm 31, and I've spent most of my adult life being the one people call when something breaks, emotionally, financially, structurally. I work as an interior architect in Austin, specialize in restoration projects, and have a habit of trying to fix things that probably shouldn't be fixed. This time, though, it wasn't a crumbling staircase or a warped ceiling. It was blood. And I couldn't glue it back together. What made it worse wasn't just the betrayal. It was the silence afterward. No one called to check on me. No one tried to make it right. I spent 2 weeks replaying the months before, wondering how I hadn't seen it coming. The late-night texts about budget changes. The passive-aggressive comments over brunch. The way Marissa's fiancé, Trevor, never looked me in the eye after I suggested scaling down the menu instead of adding another loan. I should have known. The final blow came over dinner. Not just any dinner, Sunday family dinner at my aunt's house. A tradition I hadn't missed in 6 years. The air was already thick when I walked in. Conversation stilled, eyes dropped. Even the dog wouldn't come to me. Marissa was already seated, her newly purchased engagement ring catching the chandelier light every time she shifted her hand. My uncle poured wine into only 7 glasses. Not 8. Then, with theatrical timing, my aunt stood and cleared her throat. Leah, she said, we've all talked, and we think it's best if you step back from this event altogether. I blinked. She added, and if you continue to stir tension, we'll have no choice but to take formal steps. My cousin Rachel, always the quiet one, flinched. I could feel my breath tighten. Formal steps? I asked. Trevor, finally finding his voice, said, legal ones. Defamation, if necessary. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even stand. I just sat there, wine untouched, while 7 pairs of eyes waited for me to cry, or shout, or plead. I didn't. I stood, picked up my coat, and walked out. What they didn't know was that I'd already begun pulling the thread they'd tried so hard to hide. And I wasn't going to stop. They thought I would beg for forgiveness. Instead, I disappeared. Not in the dramatic, throw my phone into a river kind of way. Just quietly. I turned down my usual Saturday brunch with Rachel, stopped answering group texts, let calls go to voicemail. Even the email I sent to my aunt, a short, clinical message withdrawing my financial contribution, was met with silence. Not anger. Not regret. Just absence. And maybe that stung more than anything else. I spent the following week in my grandmother's house. Not by plan, not for nostalgia, but because the quiet there made more sense than the noise of my apartment. I hadn't been back since she died 3 years ago, but I still had the keys. My mother never wanted the place, too old, too full of maintenance, too far from the city. So it sat, mostly untouched, waiting. The sheets were stale, the refrigerator empty, but her slippers were still under the bed. Her reading glasses still on the side table. And her scent, lavender and spearmint, lingered faintly in the fabric of the armchair where she used to sit for hours, shelling peas and humming softly. I slept on the couch the first night, fully dressed, wrapped in one of her old cardigans. It still had a button missing. I never replaced it. It was here, in this house, that I remembered what the word family used to mean before it became a synonym for leverage. My grandmother never asked me for anything, even when she needed help. She never manipulated, never angled. Her love was quiet and constant, like the sound of her kettle whistling from the next room. When I was 13, I spent a summer here while my parents were working through things. I learned how to iron napkins, balance a checkbook, and grow tomatoes from seeds. She let me paint the guest room walls any color I wanted. I chose a green that didn't match anything, and she said it was the best decision the house had seen in years. She made everything feel like a collaboration, not an obligation. Sometimes, when I couldn't sleep, I'd wander into the kitchen and find her already there, making chamomile tea or cleaning something that didn't need cleaning. She never asked why I was up. She'd just hand me a mug and sit with me in silence until I was ready to speak. It's in that same kitchen now, sitting at the same scarred table, that I start sorting through receipts. Not from the wedding, I'd deleted those. From the estate account she left me. She'd made me executor even though I was the youngest grandchild, and at the time it caused some mild grumbling. But no one argued too hard. Back then, they still pretended to like each other. The account was modest. She had no stock portfolio, no offshore secrets. Just her house, a few savings bonds, and a savings account with barely enough to cover her funeral. But she'd insisted I oversee every penny. "I trust you," she said. "Because you won't just do what's right, you'll know what that is when the time comes." I didn't understand what she meant back then. I thought she was just being poetic. But now, it echoes like prophecy. By the third day, I've turned one of her empty rooms into a workspace. I spread out everything I've gathered over the years: emails, Venmo screenshots, scribbled notes from conversations I didn't realize I was documenting at the time. My family had a pattern. And it was always the same. Make the ask. Inflate the crisis. Minimize the damage when questioned. Repeat. The wedding was just the latest performance. 2 years ago, Marissa asked me for help paying off her graduate school debt, except she'd never graduated. She'd dropped out after a semester and lied to everyone except me. She was ashamed, she said. She didn't want the family to know. I wired her the money anyway. Last summer, Trevor borrowed $5,000 to cover a delayed payment from a client. I later found out he'd used it for a weekend trip to Miami with his college friends. He never paid it back. These were not desperate people. Just entitled ones. And I had allowed it for so long that they mistook my silence for permission. That was my mistake. Now, as I go through each piece of proof, my emotions don't rise. There's no flare of anger or ache of betrayal. Just clarity. Cool and precise. I create a timeline. Then a pattern of inconsistencies. Then a list of names, wedding vendors, loan officers, even the catering company Marissa claimed had refused to refund. I contact them all. I'm polite. Professional. I ask questions, verify statements, collect confirmations. I make no accusations. I just let the facts settle into place like sand in a jar. Each response chips away at their story. The reception venue, for example, was never booked. The company had no record of Marissa or Trevor. The upgrade they'd blamed on me was a fabrication. A tactic. So was the supposed contract cancellation fee. And the photographer? A friend of Trevor's. Unlicensed, uninsured, and, it turns out, unaware his name was even being used. By the 5th day, I'd built a quiet little war chest of truth. But it's not for court. It's not for revenge in the public sense. I have something else in mind. I email Rachel. She's the only one who ever told me the truth when I asked for it. The only cousin who apologized for not saying more at that dinner. She writes back within the hour, her tone cautious but kind. "Are you okay?" she asks. I don't answer that part. Instead, I ask if she's still close to Mr. Diaz, the tax consultant who helped her after her audit last year. She says yes. Offers to connect us. I thank her. Later that evening, I sit by the window in the guest room. The green walls are faded now, but still oddly comforting. The wind rustles the trees outside, and for the first time in days, I let myself exhale. There is something deeply satisfying about restraint. About knowing what you're capable of, and choosing a quieter route anyway. But silence isn't the same as surrender. And the next step I take will make that clear. They didn't raise their voices. They raised their expectations, and used them like weapons. I met with Mr. Diaz 2 days later, not in a sleek conference room or through a scheduled Zoom call, but at a small cafe off South Lamar. He wore a soft gray sweater that looked more like something borrowed from a brother than bought for business. His handshake was brief, his eyes sharp. We kept it casual. I gave him an overview of the situation, selective, but accurate. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally taking notes on a yellow legal pad that looked too old to still be in use. After I finished, he asked one question. He said, "What do you want from this?" It caught me off guard. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because no one had asked me that before. Not Marissa. Not my aunt. Not even Rachel. I replied, "I want them to stop acting like they're owed something from me." He didn't write that down. Instead, he asked for the documents I'd compiled. I handed over a USB drive. He promised to follow up in a week. That evening, I returned to the house. The porch light had burned out, so I left it dark. I made tea, sat in my grandmother's chair, and watched the tree sway in the wind. It occurred to me that no one had asked where I'd gone. Not a single text. Not even a passive-aggressive comment on social media. The silence had sharpened into something deliberate. But beneath that, there was something more familiar. They were waiting, for me to crack, to apologize, to quietly resume my place in the family structure. The dependable cousin. The reliable contributor. The wallet and heels. When people talk about family manipulation, they always focus on what's said, guilt trips, lies, dramatics. But the most dangerous kind is quiet. It's in the pauses between words. The way your name is left off a group message. The way they talk about you as if you're not in the room. The way they act surprised when you finally draw a line, as if they hadn't spent years erasing you one subtle erasure at a time. I hadn't seen it clearly before. Now, it was all I could see. The text started that weekend. My aunt, first, a photo of a centerpiece for the wedding. No message. Just the image, as if I'd been part of the planning all along. Then a follow-up from Marissa, "Still hoping you'll reconsider." I didn't answer either. On Sunday, Rachel called. Her voice was soft, strained. She didn't mention the wedding. Instead, she asked if I wanted to go for a walk like we used to. I hesitated. Then agreed. We met at the lake trail just before sunset. She wore a puffer vest and brought 2 thermoses of coffee. We walked slowly, the kind of silence between us that didn't need explanation. Eventually, she said, "They're saying you've changed." I laughed once, quietly. It didn't feel like a compliment, but it also didn't feel wrong. I said, "Maybe I just stopped playing the same part." She didn't argue. Instead, she offered something unexpected. She said, "They're planning to sue you. For emotional distress. Trevor's uncle is drafting the papers." We stopped walking. I turned to her, searching her face for a hint of exaggeration. There was none. I should have been afraid. Or at least shaken. But I wasn't. I was tired. And oddly, relieved. Because they'd just shown their hand. This wasn't about family. This was about ownership. About consequence. And they had mistaken my withdrawal for weakness, not knowing that I was doing what our grandmother had taught me. Observing. Preparing. Rachel handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a draft letter. Dated 2 weeks ago. An internal memo from a local law office, Trevor's uncle's firm. It detailed a proposed complaint alleging defamation and financial interference. It was thin. Baseless. The kind of threat meant to intimidate someone into compliance. It didn't work. I thanked her. She nodded, eyes wet, but said nothing. When I returned home, I forwarded the letter to Mr. Diaz. He called the next morning, his voice low but certain. He said, "They don't have a case. But you have leverage." I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. Leverage isn't just legal. It's emotional. Strategic. It's knowing where the fractures are before anyone else does. Over the next week, I worked quietly. I contacted the venue that had never been booked. Asked for a formal statement of non-engagement. Then the supposed caterer, who confirmed no contract existed. I requested affidavits, simple, declarative, notarized. I added them to the growing file. Rachel sent me another document, one I hadn't expected. A bank statement she'd accessed while helping Marissa organize the wedding finances. It showed a series of transfers, money withdrawn from their joint account and funneled into a private one in Trevor's name. The pattern was consistent. The amounts were small enough to avoid suspicion but frequent. And one withdrawal matched, exactly, the last check I had written for them. It wasn't about the wedding. It was about the game. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel the betrayal anymore. Just a kind of steadiness. Like standing in cold water and realizing, slowly, that you no longer feel the chill. Mr. Diaz assembled the full report and offered to file a counterclaim preemptively. I declined. Not yet. Instead, I printed it all, every page, every screenshot, every signed statement. I slipped them into a plain black binder and wrote 3 names on the front. Marissa. Trevor. And my aunt. I mailed it overnight. No letter. No explanation. Just the truth. Then I waited. Not for a response. But for the weight of silence to finally shift. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a pause between text messages. I didn't hear anything for 4 days after I mailed the binder. Not a call. Not a demand. Not even a denial. The silence had changed. This wasn't the smug, dismissive quiet they used before, this was the brittle stillness of someone waiting for the floor to drop. I spent those days finishing small projects around the house. Repainting a few windowsills. Clearing the gutters. Tending the soil in my grandmother's dormant garden. There was something oddly grounding about putting my hands in dirt while the people who'd once called me family scrambled behind closed doors. I wasn't in hiding. I was preparing. The morning of the 5th day, an envelope slid through my mail slot, hand-delivered, no return address. I picked it up carefully, as if it might burn. It was cream-colored and thick, the kind of paper used for wedding invitations or cease and desist letters. Inside was a single page. No law firm letterhead. No signature. Just 5 lines. We acknowledge your position. We will not proceed with legal action. You are released from any financial obligation. Your presence at the wedding is neither expected nor desired. We hope this concludes the matter. I read it 3 times. Then folded it, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed it in the junk drawer next to a rusted tape measure and 2 broken pens. It was done. But it wasn't over. Because now they were afraid of what I might do next. I never intended to destroy them. I wasn't out for vengeance in the scorched earth sense. But I also wasn't going to protect them from the consequences of their own manipulations. There's a quiet kind of power in restraint. And I planned to use it. That week, I met with Mr. Diaz again, this time in his office. It was modest, no receptionist, no glass walls, just a few overstuffed bookshelves and a framed diploma above his desk. He offered me water from a small fridge in the corner. I declined. He said, "They backed down." I replied, "Yes. But not because they had a change of heart." He nodded. Then asked if I wanted to take it further: civil fraud, public exposure, even quiet inquiries through local business ethics committees. He said, "You have options." I told him I needed time. Because sometimes, withholding the next move is more strategic than making it. Instead, I made a different kind of list. I went back through my financial history, not just with Marissa, but with every family member who had ever borrowed, pleaded, or implied. I wasn't tallying for reimbursement. I was cataloging behavior. Creating a map of entitlement, connection by connection. My name appeared on 14 transfers. 5 cash loans. 3 Venmo requests labeled "just until Friday." 1 co-signed lease. Not a single repayment. No thank you notes. No follow-ups. Just silence once the money landed. I remembered each one. The time Rachel's car broke down and I covered a $600 repair that turned out to be a weekend rental so she could visit her ex. The time Aunt Lisa said her utilities were about to be shut off, then posted photos from a weekend spa retreat. Even Trevor. A year ago, he called me about an urgent opportunity, a friend of a friend with a startup in the CBD industry. He said I could double my money in 6 months. I never saw the funds again. It wasn't just the money. It was the story behind it every time. A lie. Dressed up as a plea. Each memory added another stitch to the seam that had once connected me to these people. And with each stitch, I felt less grief and more clarity. I wasn't family to them. I was an asset. One they no longer controlled. The final name I wrote down was my mother's. It surprised me, at first, how far back it all went. The small emotional trades in childhood: love for silence, presence for compliance. The way she'd raise her eyebrow when I disagreed. How she'd clutch her wineglass a little tighter when I challenged her version of an event. I used to think I misunderstood her. Now I knew I had understood her perfectly, even back then. She just never expected me to remember. The emotional pressure began again in subtle waves. A voicemail from my uncle, dripping with forced civility: "Leah, just checking in, haven't heard from you. Hope you're well." A Facebook tag from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, a throwback photo from a family picnic, captioned "Miss those days." Then finally, an email from my aunt. A different tone this time. Less condescending, more contained. She said they were moving forward as a family and preferred to leave the past in the past. She wished me peace. I didn't respond. Instead, I contacted the estate lawyer who handled my grandmother's affairs. Not to reopen anything, but to update my file as executor. I informed him that any claims or suggestions made in the name of family consensus were not valid unless documented and approved. I copied Mr. Diaz on the correspondence. Then I let it sit. No action. Just presence. I'd become the variable they couldn't predict anymore. And the silence that followed was no longer theirs. It was mine. I visited Rachel once more before I left the house. She met me at a bookstore on 12th, where we used to hide from extended family gatherings when we were younger. She brought a bag of lemon scones and sat across from me with the nervous energy of someone caught between sides. She apologized again, without words this time. Just in the way she looked at me when I handed her the binder I'd retrieved from the post office. I said, "Keep it. For your own protection." She hesitated, then took it. Outside, the wind had shifted. The clouds were low, heavy with something just shy of rain. I stood there for a moment, the bag of scones tucked under my arm, and watched her disappear around the corner. It was done. But I hadn't left yet. And I had one more thing to do. Revenge isn't loud. It's precise. I scheduled the meeting for a Wednesday afternoon. Neutral location. Downtown notary office. Just another beige room with too much artificial light and chairs that made you sit too straight. The kind of space designed for signatures and discomfort. They arrived separately, my aunt first, followed by Marissa and then Trevor. None of them greeted me. Trevor wore a blazer that didn't fit his shoulders. Marissa looked like she hadn't slept. My aunt refused to make eye contact. I didn't bother with pleasantries. A woman from the office brought in a tray with water bottles and left the door slightly ajar. I slid the file folder across the table and waited while they stared at it like it might explode. I said, "This isn't about money. I don't want anything back." Trevor scoffed under his breath but didn't speak. I let the silence settle. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. I said, "I want formal documentation that I was never involved in this wedding. No financial liability. No name on any agreement. I want it notarized. Today." My aunt flinched. Marissa opened her mouth, then closed it again. I handed over a second document. I said, "And this one is for me." It was a statement of closure. A quiet ending. A list of every transaction, every text, every ask. A record, not for legal action, but memory. It said everything I needed to say without explanation. It said, "I see what you did. I see who you are. And now, I'm not part of it anymore." I didn't look at them as they read. Instead, I watched the window. A pigeon had landed on the ledge outside and was pecking at something invisible. I wondered how long it had taken to get there. How many detours it had made along the way. Trevor spoke first. He said, "This is ridiculous." I replied, "Then don't sign it." He fell quiet. My aunt took the pen and signed both documents. No hesitation. Just resignation. Marissa's hand shook. She whispered, "I didn't want it to turn out like this." I didn't answer. Because she had. Maybe not in words, but in choices. And choices were louder than apologies. Once the paperwork was complete, the notary returned and stamped everything. Her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who's witnessed hundreds of endings. No one said goodbye. They left the room one by one, the door closing behind them with the soft finality of a drawer that no longer needs to be opened. I sat for a moment after they were gone. The chair still cold beneath me. The fluorescent light still humming. But the weight that had clung to my shoulders for months, that invisible pressure of obligation and inherited guilt, had finally eased. I wasn't angry. I was free. That night, I packed the last of my things from the house. Folded the sheets. Emptied the fridge. Left the garden tools exactly where I'd found them. I wrote a short letter for the next tenant, just in case someone moved in before the air had cleared. I drove back to the city just after midnight. The highway was nearly empty. I kept the windows down. The wind was sharp, but I needed to feel it. To remind myself I was moving forward by choice, not necessity. In my apartment, I left the boxes stacked by the door. I didn't unpack. I didn't turn on the lights. I just walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and sat on the floor. For the first time in weeks, I slept. The next morning, there was an email waiting. From Rachel. It was short. "They're talking. They're calling it a misunderstanding. They're rewriting it. Just wanted you to know." I didn't respond right away. Because that was the final twist, wasn't it? They wouldn't learn. They would regroup. Shift the narrative. Protect their image. Tell themselves whatever they needed to hear to make it fit inside the family myth they'd built. But it wouldn't include me. That realization didn't sting. It settled. I was no longer part of the story they told each other. And that was the story I had been waiting to write for myself. I stared at my apartment. Clean, silent, mine. There was no ceremony to this kind of liberation. No applause. No new chapter written in bold ink. Just space. And the decision about what came next. You don't realize how much weight you've been carrying until it's gone. And then your body aches from the absence. The days that followed the meeting passed without shape. Time softened. I didn't set alarms. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't answer the phone. For the first time in months, maybe years, I had nothing to protect, no drama to preempt, no fire to smother before it spread. I thought about disappearing entirely. Not in the literal sense. But leaving the city, selling everything, starting over where no one knew my name. A fantasy born from fatigue, not desire. What I needed wasn't erasure, it was reclamation. I started small. I blocked Marissa's number. Then my aunt's. Then Trevor's, though I doubted he'd ever try again. I unfollowed, unsubscribed, disengaged. I didn't post a declaration. I just receded. Quietly. Deliberately. There's something surgical about that kind of exit. Clean. Precise. It doesn't scream or warn. It simply removes itself like a tooth that no longer serves a purpose. Rachel reached out again, more hesitantly this time. She asked if I was okay. I replied, I'm resting. She didn't push further. And I appreciated that. I spent a few days organizing my files. Deleting things that no longer served me. I archived the wedding folder, encrypted, and stored it on an external drive I would likely never open again. I made backups of my financial documents. Rewrote my will. It felt morbid at first, but then freeing. My life, in clear lines and legal definitions. No one would misinterpret it again. I made a note to update the beneficiaries on my accounts. There was no one immediate to name, but that didn't trouble me. Legacy wasn't about blood. It was about values. And I still had time to decide who was worthy of that. Word began to circulate. Not publicly, just within that small, toxic circle. Through Rachel's cautious updates, I learned they were minimizing what happened. Calling it a disagreement. A misunderstanding. Marissa was under a lot of pressure, my aunt deeply hurt, Trevor misguided but not malicious. They were doing what they did best. Rewriting the truth to fit their comfort. I didn't interfere. Let them talk. Let them host a wedding without crisis. Let them pretend none of it happened. My presence was no longer required for the truth to exist. What mattered was the space I had reclaimed. I went back to work slowly. Not full-time. Just enough to reconnect with something that hadn't been tainted by all of this. My first project was a small restoration, a pre-war craftsman on the east side. The owner was a retired professor, gentle and meticulous, who wanted the original trim preserved and the porch rebuilt by hand. It was the kind of work that pulled you back into your body. Measuring, sanding, tracing grain lines. The quiet rhythm of effort without emotional debt. I wore gloves the first week, even indoors. Not for protection, just to keep from feeling too much too quickly. The owner made tea every afternoon. We never sat together, but he'd leave a cup near the doorway. A silent offering. No expectations, no assumptions. Just presence. One afternoon, as I packed up my tools, he appeared at the door. He said, "The porch will last another 100 years now." I nodded. I replied, "It was built right the first time. Just needed care." He smiled and didn't press. That night, I walked the long way home. Through streets that glowed gold under the early autumn dusk. My body was sore in the honest way. Not from tension, but from work. It was a different kind of tired. That weekend, I received an invitation. A hand-addressed envelope, cream cardstock. Marissa and Trevor's wedding. I stared at it for a long time, then placed it unopened on my desk. Later, I burned it. Not out of anger. Just finality. The ash curled into itself, silent and clean. Rachel called the next morning, her voice uncertain. She said, "I told them it was a mistake to send that." I didn't ask whether she meant mistake tactically or ethically. I replied, "It doesn't matter now." She paused, then asked if we were still family. I didn't answer right away. Because family, to me, had always meant loyalty without cruelty. Support without strings. Not proximity. Not blood. I said, we're something. I just don't know what yet. She accepted that. The wedding came and went. I didn't look at photos. I didn't ask questions. I spent that weekend in the garden behind my grandmother's house, now tended by a new tenant who'd left a note on the gate inviting me back anytime. I planted new herbs beside the fence. Left no note. Just roots. 2 weeks later, I received another envelope. This one from a lawyer I didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice: Marissa and Trevor had dissolved their LLC. The business they'd planned to launch with my early contributions, under false pretenses, no longer existed. It was over. I didn't feel satisfaction. Just silence. The clean kind. But part of me still waited, for something unnamed, unfinished. A door left cracked open. A question not yet asked. Closure didn't come in a single moment. It arrived in pieces, small, unceremonious, often unnoticed until I found myself breathing easier. The letter from the lawyer was the last official thread. But the real end didn't feel like an ending at all. It was quieter than that. Like a background hum that slowly faded, and you didn't realize it had been bothering you until it stopped. I didn't tell anyone when I got the notice. Not Rachel, not Mr. Diaz. It didn't seem necessary. The gesture was symbolic, but the damage had been real. Whatever business they'd claimed to be building was never about ambition, it was about leverage. A way to turn proximity into profit. Now it was gone. Dissolved. Like trust. A week later, I received a postcard from the garden tenant. It was pressed with real violets, handwritten in a looping script that reminded me faintly of my grandmother's. Your sage is thriving. The soil remembered you. I stood in my kitchen, rereading it. The words were simple, but they reached somewhere deep. There are things the body knows before the mind is ready. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted. Not in them. In me. I was no longer waiting. Not for apologies. Not for explanations. Not even for acknowledgement. I had lived the truth, and that was enough. Still, there were moments when the past brushed up against me. At the grocery store, hearing someone call a name that wasn't mine but sounded close. A passing car playing the same song that used to play during Sunday dinners. The occasional ache that came not from longing, but from memory. These were not wounds. Just echoes. I leaned into my work again, not as a distraction, but as a return. My hands remembered the rhythm of rebuilding, of precision. Projects came in slowly: referrals, repeat clients. One was a small library renovation on the west side, funded by a local nonprofit. I spent long days surrounded by dust and wood shavings, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to check my phone. People began to see me differently, not because I had changed, but because I had stopped shrinking to fit their comfort. Even Rachel. She texted sometimes. Nothing heavy. A photo of a new book. A comment about the weather. An invitation for coffee I sometimes accepted, sometimes didn't. I let her exist in the gray space. Not forgiveness. Not exile. Just realism. She hadn't betrayed me. But she'd stood close to those who had. And that required distance. One Sunday morning, I visited the lake alone. It was overcast, wind rolling off the water in cool waves. I walked the trail without urgency, watching the ducks move as a single body, no leader, no lag. Just instinct. At one of the benches, I paused. The trees were beginning to turn. Gold edging into green. The first hints of fall, not yet loud, but certain. A transition without fanfare. Just honesty. I sat there for a long time, thinking about my grandmother. What she would have said. What she wouldn't have needed to. She had always trusted me to know when the moment came to act, to step back, to let go. She never taught me to fight loud. She taught me to fight clean. Not to destroy, but to disengage with dignity. And I had done that. Not perfectly. But fully. That evening, I started packing again, not to leave, but to simplify. I donated clothes I hadn't worn in years. Shredded old documents. Closed accounts I no longer used. It wasn't purging. It was refinement. Removing what no longer held weight. I kept the binder in a locked drawer. Not as a threat. Just a record. The past had happened. And I wouldn't let anyone rewrite it. But I also didn't need to read it again. Not unless they came knocking. And if they did, I'd be ready. But I didn't expect them to. And I didn't need them to. One night, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment. Just 3 people, clients who'd become friends, a neighbor who'd helped me carry lumber up the stairs, and a former colleague who'd gone freelance too. We ate slowly, laughed gently, traded stories about nothing important. No one asked about my family. No one needed to. I was not the girl who tried to make herself indispensable in exchange for approval. I was not the woman who paid for weddings to be tolerated. I was simply Leah. 31. Intact. And finally, unowned. After they left, I washed the dishes by hand, even though I had a dishwasher. I liked the feel of warm water, the rhythm of it. When I finished, I opened the windows. Let the evening air in. Sat by the sill and watched the street lights flicker on one by one. I thought about what legacy meant now, not wealth or reputation, not tradition or name. But peace. The ability to live a life that didn't require explanation. The right to decide who could access you. And the strength to know when to close the door. I didn't need to win. I just needed to be free. And I was. Finally.